It was at this point that I reached what the Napoleons call an impasse. I mean to say, on the heels of our swashbuckling, nerve-wracking escape from the Regent's lair, we'd suddenly ground to a halt and found ourselves embroiled, if that's the expression, smack dab in the middle of a dull, dry, yawn-inducing chat about science. This put me squarely onto the horns of a dilemma. Should I asked myself, continue my work as the author's scribe, dutifully jotting down everything that passed from Norm's lips as he explained the ins and outs of Isaac's scientific plans, or should I write in broader strokes, merely giving my public the gist? Give them too deep an account of the whithertos and wherefores of Isaac's ruddy plan, and their eyes may gloss over. The book might tumble from their hands, and my readers, if any, may find themselves drooling where they sit as they slip into a sleep plagued by nightmares in which they are chased by angry lab coats and scanning electron thingamies. On the other hand, if I simply give them what you might call a bird's-eye view of what Norm said, writing something along the lines of, never mind the details, but there's science afoot, and you'll have to take my word that it will all make sense, they'll roll their collective eyes, adopting the justifiable view that one of the minor plot lines in this volume, viz., Isaac's scientific busybodying and the original mission on which Abe had sent me, never really accounted to anything or made one jot of sense. You can see the difficulties I'm facing. I've noted the same issue arising in comic books I've read. You hope to spend an idle hour poring over Wonder Chap's acts of daring-do, enjoying his leaps and bounds over buildings and his races with locomotives, when you find yourself mired in a series of dull, boring panels in which an overzealous writer has tried to explain the physics behind the hero's powers, answering questions like, how can Wonder Chap propel himself in a vacuum? Or, when the arch-villain Wicked Chump bench presses a building, why doesn't the whole thing buckle and crumble all around him, leaving him bathed in rubble and ruin? Yield to that impulse to explain the principles behind these hitherto unexplained fantastical things, and you're apt to find you can't, so you cheat the thing a bit and find yourself hip-deep in midi-chlorians or homeopathy or genetic memory or some other unempirical weirdness that fails the test of peer review. Pseudo-scientific babbling, I mean to say. The science fails to please the discerning eye, the fantasy is ruined, and the plot is stalled by unnecessary gobbledygook. On the other, you try to explain why all the fantastical bits are firmly rooted in science. I think you'll agree that authors of comic books, science fiction, or fantasy thingamies have to tread a fine line. In the present instance, perhaps it was best to err on the side of crossing all of the T's and dotting the I's, doing my best to convey the flavour of what was said, while giving impatient readers the option of skipping down 2 or 3 pages, perhaps until a paragraph or 2 before the conclusion of the chapter. Turning back to the present slab of dialogue, Vera had just asked why Isaac gave a tinker's damn about the Regent's perilous passage to the Beforelife, and Norm was on the point of offering up an explanation. Here's what he said. That's the ingenious bit, and it's why we're going to help him. Isaac's only goal in any of this is to see what happens. He wants to see what happens when someone passes from this world to the Beforelife, making careful observations and seeing what he can learn about passing information across the boundary between worlds. Vera chewed on a lower lip, her own, in fact, and she followed this up with speech. "I think I see what you're driving at," she said, which made for one of us. "I mean, we already know information can pass between the Before Life and Detroit." "We do?" I said, interrupting. "Well, of course we do," said Vera. "People come here when they die." "But people aren't information." "Well, of course they are. Information that's encoded in DNA and memory engrams and, well, what you call character sketches. Each of us is information. It's the same principle that underlies the idea of teleportation. Transmit all of the information about an object from one place to another. Teleportation isn't real. At least it isn't anymore," I said helpfully. "Well, sometimes it's real," said Norm, interjecting. "I mean, Isaac can make exceptions. He explained it to us earlier. Not long ago, he forced the ancients to believe that teleportation was impossible, which meant that it certainly was. But half an hour ago, he found he needed to make it possible again, so that the Regent could, using her pyramidical totem, create the portal that brought you here. So he reintroduced the concept by changing the ancients' minds again. And we get the idea," said Vera, waving off the bearded babbler before turning her attention back to me in the hope of easing my considerable bafflement. "The point I'm trying to make is that information can pass between the Before Life and Detroit. When Ian came through the sticks with his memories intact, all of the information stored in his brain came here from the Before Life. That information crossed the boundary between one world and the next. And when the Napoleons reincarnate, moving back to the Before Life from Detroit, that proves that information can move back in the other direction, if you see what I mean." "That's it exactly," said Norm. "Isaac wants to observe the passage of information between two worlds. That's all he wants." "Why in Abe's name would he do that?" I asked. I mean, I didn't precisely care why anyone would want to pierce a veil or two between a couple of worlds, but it did strike me as an odd use of one's time. Vera surprised me by stepping in and fielding this question, one I'd expected to have been grabbed by Norm. "Don't you see?" she said, which was a silly thing to ask, because of course I didn't. "He wants to replicate the process. He wants to gather information from the Before Life. Scientific observations, measurements, that sort of thing." The look on my face must have indicated that this was going to require some amplification, for she forged on, sprinkling the landscape with necessary details. "The Before Life isn't like Detroit. It's governed by physical laws. Its rules will correspond to Isaac's math. Here in Detroit, Isaac has to make calculations in a sort of vacuum. He can calculate all he wants, but if his calculations reveal anything that's outside the collective expectations of the ancients, he can't confirm his math by observation. He might, through his math, prove that dark matter ought to exist or that black holes keep popping up all over the place, but if these things don't check up with the expectations of the ancients, he'll never observe them here and never know if the solutions he proposed through his calculations are correct in a physical world. He can't confirm them by observing things because the world he observes here doesn't conform to physical laws. But the Before Life is different. His observations of how everything works in the Before Life will advance his work and help confirm his calculations. He'll be able to confirm his findings by measuring them against the things he sees there. And once he's managed to take stock of the quantum structure of the Before Life, his grand calculations will be complete. said Norm. "He'll fundamentally understand the nature of physical laws. That's all he's ever really wanted." Why anyone would want this was beyond me. I mean to say, I was merely hearing about the process, and this was enough to cause the eyelids to grow heavy and the mind to wander. Vera seemed keen to pursue the point, for she seemed to raise some objection or call for a point of clarification. She started by weighing in with the words, "But that isn't really true, is it?" At which point speechlessness supervened, due to the advent of none other than Isaac Newton himself. He toddled into the lecture hall, not seeming the least bit surprised by the presence of an elevator, which hadn't been there before, and it warmed my heart to see that, unlike most people I'd met in the last few days, he seemed more than a little pleased to bump into me, rather than curling his lip, scoffing or pinching the bridge of his nose on catching sight of yours truly. This Mensa freak clapped his hands, unleashed a smile that a dental hygienist would have been proud of, and said, "Excellent! Let's get started." And if you're anything like me, the sort of chap who pays attention to narrative structure and what have you, then you'll know that Isaac saying anything like, "Let's get things started," is likely to herald the coming of the end of the present book. Strap in, gentle reader, and prepare for the climax, denouement, and closing word.